Hey guys, tonight we're going to start with a party. It's a sugaring off dance in the woods of Wisconsin sometime in the early 1870s. There's a fiddle and a bugle and a room full of relatives and an old woman who takes the floor and outdances a young man half a century younger than she is. Her heels are clicking under her skirts. Her cheeks are red. He gives out first. If you've read Little House in the Big Woods, you know that scene. It's called Dance at Grandpa's, and it is probably the happiest chapter Laura Ingalls Wilder ever wrote. The woman dancing was real. Her name was Laura Louise Colby Ingalls, and Laura was named after her. She had 10 children. She buried one of them without giving it a name. She and her husband lost the family farm to a sheriff's auction over unpaid taxes, and in the summer of 1883, at 72 years old, she moved onto raw homestead land in the far northwest corner of Wisconsin and was dead by October. That is what's on the other side of that chapter, and it is not in any book. If these quiet histories are what finally lets you sleep, subscribe, but only if you honestly like what happens here. Tell me in the comments what town you're in tonight and what the clock says. Our 3 little books are at prairiesecrets.com. On a television, scan the code on the screen. On a phone, the links are in the description and the pinned comment. And if you go under before Louisiana, good. I'll keep watch. So what are we actually doing tonight? The Little House books are full of women who arrive, do one thing, and are never mentioned again. A grandmother at a dance, an aunt in a pink dress who won't say whose hair she likes better, a cousin driving black ponies too fast, a cousin in the snow who suggests a game, a mother in a New York kitchen with a pantry that has become, for millions of American children, the definition of what a full house feels like. 5 women, 5 scenes, and then the page turns and they're gone. Every one of them was a real person with a full name and a death certificate. Every one of them lived another 40, 50, 60 years after the scene Laura gave her, and the records of those years are, without exception, harder than anything in the books. That's the whole video. 5 women, 5 afternoons, and the 50 years each. And before we go anywhere, one number, because it changes what a single scene is worth. The Little House books have been continuously in print since 1932. That's 94 years. They have been translated into dozens of languages, made into a television series that ran for 9 seasons, and remade again this year. Tens of millions of copies. Which means that when Laura Ingalls Wilder gave a woman one paragraph, she gave her a paragraph that has been read aloud, in bed, at night, to more children than almost any other paragraph in the language. That's a strange kind of fame. You are known by millions of people by your first name only, doing one thing forever. Aunt Lottie has been walking down that road in a pink dress, swinging her sunbonnet since 1932. She has never once got to the end of the road. And I want to be exact about how little they get, because exact is more startling than adjectives. Grandma gets one chapter. She has no dialogue at all. She dances, and she remembers the syrup in time, and that is the whole of her. Aunt Lottie gets about 2 pages, 1 line of speech, and 1 description of a pink dress and a sunbonnet. Cousin Alice gets 1 sentence of dialogue in the whole of Little House in the Big Woods. It is, I'll tell you what let's do. Let's make pictures. She's otherwise a name in a list of cousins arriving in a sled, and a pair of hands holding a doll. Cousin Lena is the exception. She gets 3 chapters, and she's magnificent in all of them, and then she says goodbye across a camp and never appears again in 8 books. And Angeline Day Wilder gets an entire novel. She's on nearly every page of Farmer Boy, and she's called Mother, and only Mother, and the book does not tell you her name once. Add it up. 5 women. Between them, across 8 books and about 500,000 words, they get perhaps 40 pages, one of them anonymous. And behind those 40 pages there are, by my count, 391 years of documented life. Where do you start with 5 of them? With the grandmother, because she's the oldest, and because her chapter is the one where you can prove, in about a minute, that the book is not a transcript. Let's go back. Let me give you the chapter properly, because it's short and because it's the reason any of us know she existed. It's sugaring off. That means late winter, the sap running, and a boiling that goes on for hours until the syrup is thick enough. It's the one event of the year that is both work and a party, and the neighbours come. The room fills up. After supper, Uncle George goes outside the door and blows his army bugle, and the book says it made a lovely ringing sound far away through the big woods. Pa plays. He calls the figures, grand right and left, swing your partners. He plays the Arkansas Traveller. And then Uncle George does a pigeon wing, which is a jumped step where you clap your heels together in the air, and he bows low in front of Grandma and starts to jig. That's a challenge. He's a young man showing off in front of the whole room, and he has picked the oldest woman there, and she takes it. Grandma's eyes were snapping and her cheeks were red, Laura writes, and underneath her skirts her heels were clicking. She keeps facing him. He keeps going. And then the detail that makes the whole scene, which is Laura noticing that Uncle George began to breathe loudly and wipe sweat off his forehead. He gives out. She doesn't. And then, having beaten a man 40 years younger in front of the entire neighbourhood, she remembers that the syrup is at the point where it will spoil, and goes and deals with it. Just in time, the book says. That is her whole appearance in American literature. One dance, one win, and back to the kitchen. She was 62 or 63 or 64. She had by then moved house at least 7 times, buried a baby, lost 80 acres to a sheriff, and been carted north into Monroe County to start over at 50. And what her granddaughter remembered 60 years later was her heels going under her skirts. The chapter is called Dance at Grandpa's. In it, Uncle George blows a bugle, and the room fills up, and Laura tells you who Uncle George is. She writes that he had run away to be a drummer boy in the army when he was 14 years old. George Whiting Ingalls was born on the 15th of July, 1851, in Concord Township, Wisconsin. He turned 14 in July of 1865. Lee surrendered in April of that year. The war was over 3 months before George was old enough to run away to it, and there is no record of George Ingalls serving in the Civil War at all. 2 of his brothers did enlist in January of 1865, right at the end. George didn't. I'm not saying that to catch Laura out. Every writer who works from a childhood memory 60 years later gets things wrong, and a family story about an uncle who ran off to the army is exactly the kind of thing a household repeats until it's true. I'm saying it because it tells you what kind of document you're holding. Little House in the Big Woods is a memory that has been shaped, and once you accept that, the interesting question stops being what's in the chapter and starts being what isn't. So who was the woman at the centre of it? She was born in 1810. The sources fight about the exact day, and I'll be honest with you about that rather than pick one and sound confident. 2 of them say the 5th of November, one says the 7th of January. Nobody discusses the disagreement, which usually means nobody has looked at the original. Her parents were Nathan Colby and Eunice Blood, and the family was settled in the Vermont Hill Country around Holland in Erie County, New York. She married Lansford Whiting Ingalls. That date is disputed too by about 21 months. September of 1830 or June of 1832, both at Holland, New York. Their first child arrived in October of 1833, which is compatible with either, so the arithmetic doesn't settle it. Lansford had been born in Quebec in 1812, the youngest of 10. His people had come down out of Canada into New York when he was small. He was a restless man in a century that rewarded restlessness right up until it didn't. They had 10 children that we can document. Peter Riley, 1833, born in Cuba Township, New York. Then, in 1835, a baby who is recorded in the family Bible only as our babe, born and died in the same year. Then Charles Phillip in 1836, who would grow up to be Pa. Then Lydia, then Polly, then Lansford James, then Laura LaDocia, who everybody called Docia, and who we will come back to in a while because her daughter is one of our 5. Then Hiram, then George, the one with the bugle, then Ruby, 10 children, one buried in 1835 under 2 words. I want to be careful here. Some accounts give the infant a name, Aaron, and cite the family Bible for it. I could not establish where that Bible is, whether it survives, or whose handwriting made the entries, so what I can tell you honestly is that there was a child in 1835, that it did not live out the year, and that the family wrote down 2 words instead of a name. Now, how many times did this family move? Quebec to New York, Cuba in Allegheny County, where at least 5 of the children were born, then Holland for the wedding, then, around 1843 or 1844, Illinois. Did they own land in Illinois or not? There's a genuine disagreement about it, and it matters, so I'll give you both sides. The land record researcher who has done the most careful work on this family says Lansford never owned property in Illinois at all, and farmed on his uncle's land in Kane County. Local Kane County researchers say something quite different. They say that by 1848 Lansford Ingalls was on the Plato Township tax rolls, holding 164 acres, and that by the 1850 census he was over in Campton Township listed as a labourer, owning nothing. Something went wrong there. If the Kane County version is right, 164 acres went with it between 1848 and 1850. I couldn't get into the Plato tax roll to check. I'm telling you the question exists and that it's open, because if it's true, then what happens next in Wisconsin isn't the first time this family lost land. It's the second. They reached Jefferson County, Wisconsin, before the middle of 1851. George was born in Concord Township that July, and on the 31st of December, 1853, Lansford Ingalls bought 80 acres, Concord Township, along the Oconomowoc River, $300. His son Peter, who was 20, witnessed the deed. Hold on to that number. $300 for 80 acres of riverland. 4 years later, in November of 1857, Lansford sold the east 40 of it to his son Charles for $460, so Pa Ingalls owned half of his father's farm at a price that says the land had gone up. And then in January of 1861, the sheriff sold all 80 acres for $700 for non-payment of taxes. Let me put those 3 numbers next to each other, because this is the whole shape of the thing. $300 in 53, $460 for half of it in 57, $700 at the auction in 61. The land was worth more than they paid for it. They lost it anyway. Not to drought, not to grasshoppers, not to a bad crop, to a tax bill, and most likely a mortgage behind it. There was a lawsuit filed against both Charles and Lansford, and who bought the farm at that auction is not recorded in any source I could find, which is its own small unpleasantness. Somebody in Jefferson County walked away with 80 acres of river bottom for $700 in January of 1861, and no historian has ever written down his name. Is there anything at all from that winter in a family voice? One document, and it is worth everything. On the 6th of October, 1861, a 21-year-old woman sat down in Concord, Wisconsin, and wrote to her sister. She had been married 20 months. Her name was Caroline Ingalls, and one day her daughter was going to write 8 books about her. The letter survives. It's at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and it's been digitized. Most of it is ordinary in the best way. She writes about the hop harvest. We have got our hops picked and pressed, she says. It took 3 weeks with 20 pickers to pick them. We have sold $250 worth. She writes about scarlet fever going through a household, a child scarlet red from head to foot. And she writes this, which is my favourite sentence any Ingalls ever put on paper. You will think I am healthy when I tell you how much I weigh. I weigh 138 pounds. That's Ma Ingalls at 21, cheerfully reporting her own weight to her sister, 9 months after the family farm went under the hammer. And in the same letter, she tells her sister where the old people have gone. Lansford and Laura, with their son Peter and his wife, have gone off to the headwaters of the Baraboo River in Monroe County. And Caroline says they feel bad about leaving their farm. That is the only contemporary account we have of the worst thing that happened to Laura Louise Colby Ingalls, and it is 4 words long, written by her daughter-in-law, in a letter that is mostly about hops. The reading we have adds a little more, that Charles's father could not save the place, that he was too old to be moving, that his health kept him from working and his doctor had told him to stop. I'd want to see the manuscript myself before I put too much weight on those lines, and I'm telling you that rather than pretending. But the destination is documented, and the destination tells you enough. They did not stay and fight it. At 48 and 50, they went north into Monroe County with one of their sons. They were in Pepin County by the beginning of 1865. On the 30th of January that year, Lansford bought land for $50, plus $5.55 in back taxes and expenses. $50. Look at what has happened to this family in 4 years. In 1853, they laid down $300 for a farm on a river. In 1865, they are buying somebody else's tax default for $50. That's the part the dance chapter can't tell you. By the time there's a fiddle and a bugle and a room full of grandchildren, these two people have already been through it. And it's worth following what that January auction did to the next generation, because it explains a man you already know. Charles Ingalls turned 25 in the very month the sheriff sold the farm. He had bought 40 acres from his father 4 years earlier for $460, which was real money, and probably most of what he had. He had married Caroline in February of 1860. He had a wife, and within 4 years 2 small daughters, and the lawsuit that took his father's land was filed against both of them, Charles and Lansford. The 40 acres he had paid for went into the same auction, so the very first property Pa Ingalls ever owned, he lost at 25, along with his father's, over taxes in a Wisconsin winter before Laura was born. Now hold that against the man in the books, the one who keeps moving, the one who's always about to make it work in the next place, the one whose restlessness the books turn into a kind of music. He had watched it happen to his father, and then it happened to him in the same courthouse, in the same month. I'm not going to tell you that explains Charles Ingalls. People are not equations. But it is a fact about him that the 8 books do not contain, and it happened before the first sentence of the first one. Before we leave the grandparents, there's a short stretch of land dealing in Pepin County that tells you more about how this family lived than any anecdote could. They bought in January of 1865, as I said, for $50 and $5.55 in back taxes. That tiny sum is the tell. That is not a purchase from a neighbour. That is buying somebody else's tax default, which is what people do when they have nothing and are willing to take the risk that comes with it. In November of that same year, Lansford sold the south half of it to his son Lansford James for $100. And then in June of 1868 he sold what he had left, 80 acres, for $1,200. $1,200 from $50. So the man knew exactly what he was doing. He bought distressed land cheap, held it 3 years, and cleared a serious profit in a county filling up with settlers. 4 months after that sale, he was filing on the Rock Elm Homestead. That's the thing about Lansford Ingalls that the dance chapter hides behind the Bugle. He was not a fool, and he was not simply unlucky. He was a speculator in a century of speculators, and it worked, and then it didn't work, and then it worked again, and every single time it turned, his wife packed the house. In October of 1868, Lansford Ingalls filed on a homestead in Rock Elm Township, Pierce County, 80 acres. And here at last we can see the house. What did it actually look like? When you prove up on a homestead claim, you have to swear to what you built. Lansford's final proof was made in 1874, and it describes a log house of over 20 feet by 35, a story and a half high, 25 acres under cultivation, a barn, a well, fruit trees and berry bushes. He calls it, in his own words, a comfortable house to live in. Over 20 by 35, a story and a half. Do the arithmetic on that, and you get a floor of at least 700 square feet with a loft over it, which is a room you could dance in. Because here is the thing about dance at Grandpa's that almost nobody notices. The chapter reads as though Grandpa's place is a short sleigh ride through the big woods from the little house in Pepin. It isn't. By 1868, the grandparents were in Pierce County, a different county, about 12 miles from Charles Ingalls' farm, and the scholars who have gone at this carefully put the dance itself somewhere between 1872 and 1874, after the family came back from Kansas. So the sugaring off, if it happened the way she remembered it, happened at Rock Elm, in the log house that the final proof describes. In the big room that Lansford swore to in front of a land officer, Laura would have been 5, 6, 7 years old, Her grandmother would have been 62, 63, 64. And I have to be straight with you about one more thing. There is no document anywhere that names the woman who danced. The chapter only names family members, which is why the researchers think it was a family gathering. And Laura Louise Colby Ingalls was Lansford's wife, and living in that house. She's the only candidate. But she is a candidate by elimination, not by evidence. Nobody wrote down that Grandma danced. 9 years after the final proof, in the summer of 1883, they moved again. She was 72. Some accounts say 73, and I think that comes from the January birth date, so I'll say 72 and note the wobble. They went about 80 miles north to Marshland Township in Burnett County, up near the Minnesota line. Homestead land on a lake called Devil's Lake, just over 143 acres. And I should say clearly, because it would be an easy mistake, that this is not the famous Devil's Lake down at Baraboo. It's a different lake, 200 miles away in the northwest corner of the state. Which is a small irony, because the Baraboo country is exactly where these two went after they lost the farm in 61. She died on the 18th of October, 1883, about 4 months after the move, at Webster in Burnett County. Nobody wrote down what she died of. She's buried at Orange Cemetery in Webster. Her husband was not finished. On the 26th of March, 1896, at 83 years old, Lansford Whiting Ingalls filed on another 80 acres in Burnett County. He died on the 21st of May, 56 days later, 8 weeks. His obituary ran in the Journal on the 29th of May, 1896, and it said this: "He died as he lived, in perfect quiet and at peace with all men. At the ripe age of 84 years he passed away. All loved and respected Grandpa Ingalls. He was 83. The paper rounded him up. He's buried at Orange Cemetery, beside her. Her children scattered the way everybody's did. Peter, the eldest, the one who witnessed the 1853 deed at 20, married Eliza Quiner and went to Minnesota and died at Malacca in March of 1900. His daughters are two of tonight's 5, in the sense that Alice is his and Ella is his. Charles went to Kansas and Minnesota and Iowa and Dakota and died at De Smet in 1902. Lydia married twice and was widowed twice and died in 1913. Polly married Ma's brother Henry, which is the second Ingalls-Quiner marriage, and died in 1888. Dosia married a man who went to Walpen, then a railroad contractor, and died in Colorado in 1918. Hiram lived until 1923. George, the one with the bugle, who did not run away to be a drummer boy, died in February of 1901, at 49. Ruby died in 1881. She was 26. 10 children, and their mother outlived at least 2 of them, and buried a third in 1835. She died in October of 1883, which means she lived to see her son Charles settled at last in De Smet, and never saw the books, and never saw her granddaughter grown. She never knew that a chapter about her dancing would outlive the entire world she spent her life inside. So what have we actually got of her? This is the thing I keep turning over. There is nothing of hers, no letter, no diary, no signature, no mark on a deed. She isn't a grantor or a grantee in any of the land records, and she didn't witness the 1853 purchase either. Her son did that. Nobody records whether she could read or write. Nobody even raises the question. Everything we have about her comes through other people's paper. Her husband's deeds, her husband's homestead file, her daughter-in-law's letter about hops, her granddaughter's novel, and a headstone. The one woman in this story that America can actually picture, dancing in a big room with her heels going, left not one word of her own behind. That's the pattern. Hold on to it. We're going to see it 4 more times tonight. The second woman shows up in chapter 10, and she's wearing pink. Ma has spent the morning curling the girl's hair in rags, and then she does something that any mother of daughters will recognize instantly and wince at. She sends them out to meet the visitor with a question in their mouths. "Your hair is curled beautifully," she says, "and Lotty is coming. Run meet her, both of you, and ask her which she likes best, brown curls or golden curls." They run down the road, and here she comes. Aunt Lottie was a big girl, Laura writes, much taller than Mary. Her dress was a beautiful pink and she was swinging a pink sunbonnet by one string. Mary asks the question, "Which do you like best, Aunt Lottie? Brown curls or golden curls?" And Aunt Lottie says the only thing a decent person could say, "I like both kinds best." And she takes them each by a hand and they dance along the road. That's it. That's her whole appearance in the Little House books. It does not end well for Laura, by the way. The rest of the chapter is the two of them at the woodpile afterwards, tired and cross. Mary says golden hair is lots prettier than brown. Laura's throat swells up until she can't speak, and then she reaches out and slaps her sister across the face, and Pa takes the strap down off the wall. So Aunt Lottie is the good thing in a chapter that goes wrong. She's the grown-up who refuses to hurt a child for the sake of an easy answer. There's an ugly little coda to the Aunt Lottie chapter, and I don't want to skip it, because it's the reason the scene is in the book at all. Lottie leaves. The two girls go out to the woodpile to gather chips for the morning fire, and they're tired and cross, which is what happens to children after company. And Mary says that Aunt Lottie likes her hair best anyway. Golden hair is lots prettier than brown, and Laura writes that her throat swelled tight and she could not speak. And then she reached out quickly and slapped her sister's face, and Pa took the strap down off the wall. That chapter is not about a nice visitor. It's about a mother who set two little girls up to compete over their own faces and then watched what happened. Ma sends them down the road with the question in their mouths. Lottie is the only adult in it who refuses to play, and the refusal costs her nothing and defuses nothing because the girls carry it to the woodpile anyway. I've read that chapter a number of times now, and I keep landing in the same place. The visitor is the only person in it behaving well, and she is the one we know nothing about. Who was she? Her name was Charlotte Elizabeth Holbrook, and she was not a big girl. She was Ma's sister, half-sister to be exact, and that half is the whole story. Go back to November of 1845. A schooner called the Ocean goes down in a storm on Lake Michigan off St. Joseph. Her captain is a man named Alexander McGregor. On board is McGregor's brother-in-law Henry Newcomb Quiner. There are no survivors. Henry Quiner leaves a widow named Charlotte and 6 living children. One of them is Caroline, who is 5 years old and who will one day be Ma. That's the drowned father. If you've watched this channel before, you know that story. So what does a woman do next in Wisconsin Territory in 1845 with 6 children and no husband? Charlotte Quiner was a dressmaker before she married. Now she's a widow in Wisconsin Territory with 6 children and no husband. And there is no version of the 1840s in which that is survivable by ordinary means. She farmed, alone, for 2 years and 3 months. And then on the 7th of February, 1848, she walked in and bought 40 acres of land from the United States government for $50, in her own name, not through a brother, not through a trustee, not held for her sons until they came of age. The grantor on that entry is the United States of America, and the grantee is Charlotte Quiner, widow, and the price is the federal minimum of $1.25 an acre. She did that 16 months before she remarried, which means she did it as a woman with no husband in 1848, when a married woman in most of this country could not have done it at all. In June of 1849 she married Frederick Holbrook, a widower with 6 children of his own. Between them they now had 12. He bought land adjoining hers, and in January of 1854, at the age of 44, Charlotte Quiner Holbrook had one more baby. That baby was Lottie. So look at where she sits in this family. She's the only child of the second marriage. She's 17 years younger than her half-sister Martha, and 14 years younger than Carolyn. She's born 9 years after the drowning, to a mother who had already buried a husband, farmed alone, and bought land by herself. She is, in the most literal sense, the child of what came after. I want to stay with Lottie's mother a moment longer, because you cannot understand the daughter without the woman who had her at 44. Charlotte Wallace Tucker was born in Roxbury, Massachusetts, in May of 1809. Before she married, she worked as a dressmaker, which in that period means she had a trade and an income of her own before any husband did. She married Henry Newcomb Quiner at New Haven, Connecticut in April of 1831. They went west, and by the middle 1840s they were in Wisconsin with a house full of children. Then November of 1845 and the schooner on Lake Michigan. She had 7 children by then and 6 of them living. Martha Morse, who had died at 4, Joseph, who would be shot at Shiloh, Henry Odin, Martha Jane, Caroline, Eliza Ann, and Thomas, who was about a year old, a widow in her middle 30s in a territory in 1845, with 6 children under 15 and the youngest not walking. She did not go home to Massachusetts. She did not marry the first man available. She farmed for 2 years and 3 months, and then she bought the 40 acres. And I want to underline what buying land in your own name meant for a woman in 1848, because it is easy to skate over. A married woman in most of the United States at that date could not hold real property separately from her husband. Her legal existence was folded into his. The one category of adult woman who could sign for land was the widow. So Charlotte Quiner's 40 acres are not just 40 acres. They are the exact and narrow window that the law of that century left open for a woman, and she went through it. Frederick Holbrook was a widower with 6 children. They married in June of 1849. He bought 40 acres adjoining hers to the north and 13.5 acres to the south, and some more ground down at Goose Lake a couple of miles off. I've seen the total given as 93.5 acres adjoining her land, and that isn't quite right, because the Goose Lake piece doesn't adjoin anything of hers. The documented adjoining acreage is 53.5. Between the 2 of them, 12 children, and then Lotty, in January of 1854. They farmed there for 17 more years. In July of 1866, they sold the whole thing, sections 11 and 14, to a man named Samuel Lockwood. Lottie was 12 when the family farm was sold, which is, incidentally, the same age the memoir gives her at the visit to Pepin. Frederick Holbrook died in February of 1874. Charlotte died in September of 1884 at Rome, in Jefferson County, living with one of her daughters. She was 75, widowed twice, a child buried at 4, a son sent to a war he did not come back from. She farmed alone, bought land in her own name, raised 12 children in a blended house, and had a baby at 44. Her granddaughter wrote 8 books about that family, and Charlotte Quiner Holbrook does not appear in any of them. Now, there's an archive I should tell you about, because it is where nearly everything documentary in tonight's episode comes from, and because of what isn't in it. The Wisconsin Historical Society holds a collection called The Laura Ingalls Wilder Family Correspondence, 1861 to 1919. You'll often see it described as 91 letters. It isn't. It is 26 letters, running to 91 pages. The page count got misread somewhere, and the mistake has been repeated ever since. Most of them are addressed to Martha Keener Carpenter and her husband Charles, and more than half of them were written by men at the war. The finding aid describes them, and this is a lovely phrase, as written in leaky tents by soldiers in the field, often in pencil or light ink. There's a letter from September of 1861 about First Bull Run. There are letters from the Siege of Atlanta. There's one from Corinth. There's one from February of 1863 that exists to tell the family that Vadine Carpenter is dead. Caroline's letter about the hops and the 138 pounds is part of that same body of paper. Lottie is not among the correspondents. She was 7 when the collection starts and 65 when it ends, and she never wrote, or nobody kept it. Whether she's mentioned inside any of those 26 letters, nobody knows. The finding aid summarizes subjects, not names. To answer it, you would have to sit down and read 91 pages of handwriting, and as far as I can establish in 90 years, nobody has. And she never went west. That's the seam. Caroline went to Pepin, and then Kansas, and then Minnesota, and then Dakota. Martha stayed in Wisconsin, and Lottie stayed too, about 200 miles east of where the little house in the Big Woods was. farming across Jefferson and Walworth and Fond du Lac counties with a man named Henry Moore. They married on the 12th of November. The year is either 1874 or 1875, and I'll tell you why I can't fix it. The same research site gives both on 2 different pages. The cemetery record says 74. There is a Wisconsin marriage index that would settle it in about 90 seconds, and I could not get into it. 6 children. Clara in 1876. Frederick in 78. A son recorded in one place as Arvin, and in another as Irwin in 1880. Harry in 82. Ralph in 87, who appears in one source and not the other. And Pearl Eva in 1888. Now here's her life, in the only terms the record gives us. Clara died in 1897. She was about 21, then a long stretch of nothing much, which in a farm record means the ordinary years, and then it comes apart. Irwin died in 1918. Fred died in 1919. Her husband Henry died on the 10th of October 1922. Harry died in 1931. 4 children buried, and a husband, and of the 6 children only Pearl Eva is certainly still alive at the end. Ralph, we don't know. She spent her last years in Pearl Eva's household, and she did not die in Wisconsin. She died on the 15th of February 1939 at her daughter's house in Waukegan, Illinois at 85. They brought her back across the state line and buried her at Evergreen Cemetery in Fort Atkinson, Section 19, Lot 2, in the county where her mother had bought 40 acres for $50, 91 years earlier. And now the thing I actually wanted to tell you. Little House in the Big Woods was published in 1932. Aunt Lottie was 78 years old and living in Wisconsin. Farmer Boy came out in 1933. She was 79. Little House on the Prairie in 1935. She was 81. On the banks of Plum Creek in 37, 83. By the Shores of Silver Lake came out in 1939, the year she died. She was alive for all of it. She outlived her half-sister Caroline by 15 years. Her niece was 72 and famous. Did she know? I searched hard for this, and I am going to give you the answer straight because the answer is itself interesting. There is no evidence either way. None. No letter from Laura to Lottie is known. No letter from Lottie to Laura is known. No researcher has written on the question. There's no obituary that anyone has found, and an obituary is exactly where a family would put a thing like that. Nobody has even asked. And here's what makes the silence louder rather than softer. Laura did write to her Wisconsin cousins about the books. There's a letter from Mansfield, Missouri, dated January of 1948, to a cousin on the Quina side, and in it Laura writes that the books are still selling well and mentions answering more than 200 Christmas cards. So she was in touch, in her 80s, writing to Wisconsin about the books. That letter is 8 years too late for Lottie. She'd been dead since 39. There's one more thing I owe you about Lottie, and it's the strangest near miss in the whole of tonight. If you go looking for a letter from Laura Ingalls Wilder to a cousin called Lottie, you will find one. It's dated the 20th of January 1948 from Mansfield, Missouri, and it opens, Dear Cousin Lottie. Your letter was a pleasant surprise, and for about 10 minutes I thought I had it. I don't. The person who transcribed that letter put a bracket in, because the handwriting is unclear, and the name could be Lottie or Letty, and the recipient is Lettice Carpenter Axtell, who was Martha Quina Carpenter's daughter, another cousin entirely. Over in Pepin, Charlotte Holbrook Moore had been dead 9 years when that letter was written. But look at what it proves anyway. In that letter, Laura, at 80, writes that the books are still selling well, and mentions that she has answered more than 200 Christmas cards and letters. So she was corresponding with the Wisconsin side of her mother's family in her old age about the books, which means the silence around the actual living aunt who is actually in one of them is not the silence of a woman who had lost touch with Wisconsin. She was in touch with Wisconsin. She was writing to Wisconsin about the books. Aunt Lottie was in Wisconsin until the 1930s, and then in Illinois, and she died in 1939. I can't tell you they never wrote. I can only tell you that nobody has found it, and that nobody has looked. One more thing, and it's a small crack in the chapter itself. In the memoir version Laura wrote before the novels, Lotty is said to be 12 years old at the time of the visit. Charlotte Holbrook was 12 in 1866. Laura Ingalls was born in February of 1867. If the age is right, the visit could not have happened. If the visit happened when Laura was 4 or 5, Lotty was 17 or 18, which fits the big girl in the pink dress much better and doesn't fit 12 at all. The land record researcher who knows this family best writes it out plainly, and I'll give you her sentence, because it is a properly honest sentence and there aren't enough of those. It is not known if Lotty ever visited her half-siblings, if the story was totally fictional, or if the story was about another relative's visit. So that's Aunt Lotty. A woman who may not have been there, in a dress that may not have been pink, giving the kindest answer in the whole book, and then living 66 more years, burying 4 of her 6 children, and dying in another state, without anybody recording whether she ever knew she was in it. The 3rd and 4th women are cousins, same generation, born 4 years apart, and Alice is a first cousin to Laura on both sides at once, because of the way this family married. They could not have ended up more differently. I want to put them side by side, because between them they show you the whole range of what was actually available to a girl born into that world in the 1860s. We'll take the loud one first. And by the shores of Silver Lake, Laura is 12 going on 13. The family has just come through scarlet fever and Mary's blindness. They go west to a railroad camp in Dakota territory, where Aunt Docia is cooking for the crews, and there is a girl there. Lena was a year older than Laura, Wilder writes. Her eyes were black and snappy, her hair was black as black can be, and it curled naturally. She is the most alive person in the book. She and Laura take the black ponies and a buggy and drive 6 miles across open prairie to fetch Aunt Docia's washing. Lena drives, because Lena is allowed to and Laura never has been. Pa never let her handle horses. The ponies trot and then they bolt, and Lena lets them run and sings the whole way. She sings 2 songs on that ride. One is a warning song, I know a young man fair to see, take care, oh take care. The other is called A Railroad Man for Me. They come back whooping. Aunt Docia looks at the pair of them and says, "You girls look as if butter wouldn't melt in your mouths. What have you been up to?" And in the middle of that ride they stop at a claim shanty, and a woman comes out looking like she hasn't slept and says that her girl was married yesterday, and here come the threshers this morning. The girl's name is Lizzie. She's 13 years old. Laura writes that Lizzie was only a little older than I am. Lena works it out loud and says, "I'm a year older than she was." And then Lena says the line that has bothered readers for 80 years. She's a silly. Now she can't ever have any more good times. Laura says no, she can't play any more now, and says she wouldn't want to be so responsible, and that she'd rather let Ma be responsible for a long time yet. And Lena says this, "I'm not ever going to get married, or if I do, I'm going to marry a railroader and keep on moving west." That is a 13-year-old girl in 1879, in a tent camp, announcing a life plan. And it is the single freest thing anybody says in the entire Little House series. Her name was Lena Evelyn Waldvogel. She was born on the 7th of November 1866 in Rock Elm Township, Pierce County, Wisconsin. The same township, as it happens, where her grandparents would file on a homestead 2 years later. Her mother was Docia Ingalls, Pa's sister, the aunt with the good sense of humour. Docia had married a Swiss-born man called August Waldvogel on the 1st of March 1866. Lena arrived 8 months and 6 days later. So what is not in By the Shores of Silver Lake, and is not in any of the 8 books, and that Laura Ingalls Wilder knew about perfectly well? On a Saturday night in May of 1868 at Rock Elm, August Waldvogel shot a man. The man's name was Milo Goodenough. It happened around 10 o'clock at night on Saturday the 9th of May. The local paper, the Pierce County Herald, reported it the following Thursday, and the details it gives are these. A shotgun, heavily loaded with shot. fired from about 10 paces, the entire charge taking effect in the face and breast. Goodnight did not die that night. The Herald says he lingered in agony until Monday morning, when death delivered him from suffering. He left a widow and 1 child. 3 weeks later, the paper carried the court listing. State of Wisconsin versus August Waldvogel, indictment for murder. Bail was set at $10,000, which in 1868 was a number designed to be impossible, and he was committed to jail at Prescott to wait for trial. In October of 1868, he was sentenced to 8 years in the state prison at Waupun, including 1 day of solitary confinement. There is a local account told later that says he shot through the door of a logging camp where he was the paymaster and claimed self-defense. There's a softer family version still, in which a group of men tried to break into the house and August fired a warning shot into the dark and hit one of them by accident. The contemporary newspaper describes a shotgun at 10 paces, full charge to the face and chest. I'll let you weigh those against each other. I know which one I think was written closest to the event, and I have to flag one honest gap. Nobody has published what he was actually convicted of. 8 years is not a first-degree murder sentence in Wisconsin, so it was a lesser count, but the verdict itself is not in any source I could reach. The Pierce County court file and the Waupun prison register would both settle it, and neither is online. And where is Lena while all this happens? She's 18 months old, and her mother is pregnant. Her brother, another August, was born on the 11th of August, 1868, 3 months after the shooting and 2 months before the sentencing. So Docia Ingalls spent that summer carrying a child while her husband sat in the jail at Prescott waiting to be tried for murder. She did not stay married to him. But how the marriage ended is genuinely unclear. How exactly the marriage ended is genuinely unclear, and the unclearness is interesting. In 1937, Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote to her daughter Rose about this family, and here is what she said. Lena's father was sentenced to prison for life that gave Aunt Docia a divorce. Later she married High Forbes. Oh yes, there are skeletons in our family closet, but I never felt disgraced by them until lately, and this is it. That is Laura, at 70, writing privately about her own cousin's father. Skeletons in our family closet. Never felt disgraced by them until lately. The mechanism she describes was real. Wisconsin law at the time said that if either party was sentenced to imprisonment for life, the marriage was dissolved automatically, without any decree of divorce or other legal process, and no pardon afterwards could restore the conjugal rights. But he wasn't sentenced to life. He was sentenced to 8 years. So either Laura's family had the story a little wrong after 70 years, which is entirely human, or Docia went and got an actual decree that nobody has found. No divorce date, no county, no grounds appear in any record I could reach. I'm not going to invent one. What is documented is that on the 1st of May, 1874, Docia Ingalls married Hiram Forbes, and the children took his name. By the time Laura meets her at the railroad camp in 1879, Lena Waldvogel is Lena Forbes, 13 years old, and the daughter of a man in Waupun. August Waldvogel died on the 24th of July, 1884, back in Pierce County, Wisconsin. He's buried at Plum City. The railroad, since we're there, was the Dakota Central, a line of the Chicago and Northwestern, laying track west out of Tracy, Minnesota into Dakota Territory from 1879. The camp in the book sits between Brookings and Volga, east of the Big Sioux River. Hiram Forbes was working railroad contracts that summer, and Docia was pregnant again, and her daughter Emmy was born that November. There is a family story, written down much later by one of Lena's own daughters, that Lena earned $10 helping her mother cook for the railroad crews, and that Docia put in another $5 toward a pony. I like that story, and I cannot prove it. So there it is, marked. So what happened to the girl who was never going to get married? She married, on the 29th of August, 1888, at Sioux City, Iowa. Lena Evelyn Waldvogel married Samuel Augie Heikes. She was 21. He had been born in Rock Elm Township too, the same corner of Wisconsin her people came from, 3 years before she was, They settled in Dakota County, Nebraska. She had 8 children: Agnes in 1890, Eugene in 93, Marion in 95, Samuel in 98, Lola in 1900. Then, in 1904, 2 of them, Winifred and Warren. Then Geraldine in 1907. Winifred died in 1909. She was about 5. Warren, the other child of 1904, died in 1931 at 27. Lena died on the 13th of June, 1943 at Dakota City, Nebraska. She was 76. Her obituary ran in the Sioux City Journal the next day. She's buried at Graceland Park Cemetery in Sioux City, Iowa. She never did keep moving west. She got as far as Nebraska and stopped and raised 8 children about 130 miles from where the railroad camp had been. But here's the thing I keep coming back to about Lena. The books kept the ponies. The books kept the songs. The books kept the girl who said she'd marry a railroader and keep going. The books left out the shotgun, the 10 paces, the widow and 1 child, the $10,000 bail and the 8 years at Whoopin. And they left out the fact that the black-eyed cousin driving that buggy had a father in the state prison and a surname that wasn't hers. And we know Laura left it out on purpose, because in 1937 she wrote the whole thing down in a private letter and called it a skeleton. I should tell you what a railroad camp actually was, because the book gives you a tent and a good time, and that's not the half of it. The line being built in 1879 was the Dakota Central, a line of the Chicago and Northwestern, pushing west out of Tracy, Minnesota, into Dakota Territory. The camp in by the shores of Silver Lake sat between what became Brookings and Volga, east of the Big Sioux River. A camp like that was a small town with no permanence in it at all. Graders, teamsters, track layers, mules and scrapers, and a contractor, which is what Hiram Forbes was, who took a section of grade and hired the men to move it. We can follow him that summer. In June of 1879 he was at Lake Benton. He stayed there until the 24th of July. Then he went west on contract work to a point about 9 miles from the Jim River. And where the men are, somebody has to feed them. That was Docia, a camp store and a cook shanty. 3 meals a day for a crew out of a tent on the open prairie, with no town within a day's ride. She was also pregnant. Her daughter Emmy was born that November. So Laura Ingalls arrives at that camp in the summer of 1879. 12 years old, straight out of a house where her sister has just gone blind, and what she is walking into is a mobile industrial operation run on the labour of a pregnant woman in her 30s and her 13-year-old daughter. And Laura's reaction to it, in the book, is joy. Because from where she is standing, it is the freest place she has ever been. Nobody's watching. The horses are available. There is a girl her own age who has been told no about far fewer things than she has. Both of those readings are correct at the same time, and I think that's what makes that section of the book so good. It is genuinely a holiday, and it is genuinely a work camp, and the difference between those two things is entirely a matter of which member of the family you are. That is also the last summer of it. The contract ended, the family scattered, and Laura says goodbye to her cousin on the page with one line called out across a camp. "I'll see you at Silver Lake." As far as the record shows, they never met again, and Docia, since she's the hinge of that whole branch, deserves her own ending. She married Hiram Forbes in 1874 and had 7 more daughters: Ida May in 75, Addie in 77, Emmy in November of 79, the baby she was carrying at the railroad camp, Mary Amanda in 81, Maud in 84, Flossie in 86, Catherine in 89. 2 of those daughters, Ida and Addie, were quietly left out of by the shores of Silver Lake altogether. Laura kept the ones she needed. The Forbes family went by covered wagon through Minnesota and Iowa and Dakota Territory and Nebraska, following railroad contracts, and settled for a while at Dakota City and Bancroft in Nebraska. Hiram died in 1906 at Bancroft. Docia Ingalls ended up in Colorado near her son. She died on the 18th of January 1918 at Roggan in Weld County, and she's buried at Fort Morgan. So that's Pa's sister. the one with the sense of humour, the one who arrives in the book like weather. Married at 20 to a man who shot somebody 2 years later, raised 9 children across 5 states out of a wagon, and died in Colorado. There is also, and I include it because it is exactly the kind of thing a household holds on to, a scene in that Dakota tent. Laura and Lena are lying in the dark and something makes a noise outside, and Lena says, "It's Jean, trying to scare us." And then, in the flattest voice a 13-year-old ever used, "I wasn't brought up in the woods to be scared by an owl. Jean is her brother." The real spelling was Gene, short for Eugene. His first name was August, after the father in Wopen. Laura changed one letter and left it in. The other cousin is back in Little House in the Big Woods, 4 chapters before the dance, and she is so quiet you could read past her in a second. It's Christmas in Little House in the Big Woods. A sled comes through the snow. Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter and the cousins, Peter and Alice and Ella, all under blankets and robes and buffalo skins. Then the children go out into the snow and one of them has an idea. Alice said, "I'll tell you what let's do. Let's make pictures." And that's snow angels. Each one climbs on a stump, holds her arms out wide, and falls backwards into the deep soft snow, and they spend all morning at it. Later there is candy. Peter bites a big piece off his stick. Alice and Ella and Mary and Laura lick theirs to make it last longer. And when Laura is given the doll, Charlotte, it goes round the room, and Alice holds her for a minute and smooths the dress and admires the red flannel stockings. That's the whole of Cousin Alice. One idea, 1 minute with a doll, and no description of her face at all. Laura doesn't tell us what she looked like. She doesn't give her another line. The chapter Alice is in is the Christmas one, and it's worth setting properly because it is the warmest thing in the first book. A sled comes through the snow to the little house. Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter and the 3 cousins, all of them under blankets and robes and buffalo skins, which tells you how cold it was and how far they had come. Then the children go out into the snow and Alice has her idea, and they spend the whole morning on it. Each one climbs onto a stump and holds her arms out wide and falls backwards into the deep soft snow and gets up carefully so as not to spoil the shape. Snow angels. Except Laura doesn't call them that. She calls them pictures. Later there's candy, 1 stick each, and the book notices exactly what you'd expect it to notice. Peter bites a big piece out of his. The 4 girls lick theirs to make it last longer. And then Laura is given Charlotte, the rag doll with the red flannel stockings, and the doll goes round the room, and Alice holds her for a minute and smooths her dress. That's a very good chapter. It has no plot, and it doesn't need one. And the girl who thought of the game grew up to preach. Her name was Alice Josephine Ingalls. Her father was Peter Riley Ingalls, Pa's eldest brother. Her mother was Eliza Ann Quiner, Ma's younger sister, so Alice is a double cousin. An Ingalls brother married a Quiner sister, and then another Ingalls brother married another Quiner sister, and the 2 households were bound twice over. She was born in April of 1862 in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. The exact day is a mess, and I'll show you the mess rather than hide it. The same researcher's website gives the 23rd of April in one place, and the 28th in another, and 2 different towns. The cemetery record says the 23rd. I mention the days because of what else was happening in April of 1862. Joseph Carpenter Quiner was Eliza's brother and Caroline's brother. He had enlisted in January, a private in Company B of the 16th Wisconsin Infantry. On the 6th of April, 1862, at the Battle of Shiloh, in the fighting at the Hornet's Nest, he was shot in the arm. They took him back to a field hospital at Savannah, Tennessee. The wound went bad. He died of infection on the 28th of April, 1862, and he is buried in an unmarked grave at Shiloh. Alice was born on the 23rd of that month, or the 28th. Either she was born 5 days before her uncle died, or she was born the day he died. Her middle name was Josephine. I want to be careful. Nobody wrote down that she was named for him. The middle name and the timing are all we have, and that's an inference, not a fact, and there's a difference. But the family knew what that spring cost them. Years later, Martha Quiner Carpenter wrote to Laura about it. and the sentence she used was this: "That civil war is where I lost my brother Joseph, and my husband lost his brother and other friends." Terrible. It was terrible to raise boys to manhood, then have them shot down in the war. And there's a letter from Alice's own mother from 1862 announcing the baby to that same sister, Martha. "We have had an increase in our family since last we wrote you," Eliza writes, "but I suppose you have heard of it before this time. She is the prettiest little girl you ever saw." And then, a few lines on, the sentence that tells you exactly what kind of household it was. "The baby wants me to take her, so I will have to stop writing. Peter will finish this," and Peter does finish it, and Peter has nothing to say. "Crops are very good," he writes. "Our wheat is just heading out. I can't think of what to write. If I could see you, we could find plenty to talk about." That's Alice, in the record, at a few weeks old. The prettiest little girl you ever saw, and a father who can't think what to put on paper. The family moved the way all of them moved. Jefferson County, then Pepin County, then Pierce County, then across into Minnesota around 1874 to Zumbro Falls. And in the 1880 census, Alice Ingalls is 18 years old and living with her parents, and her occupation is written down as schoolteacher. On the 20th of March, 1881, at Zumbro Falls, she married Arthur Leland Whiting. Her sister Ella was one of the witnesses, and then the two sisters did something you don't see often. 2 years later, Ella married Arthur's brother Lee. 2 Ingalls sisters, 2 Whiting brothers. Arthur filed land claims in Dakota Territory in 1882. And then in 1884, Arthur and Alice and their baby daughter Alta went to California, San Bernardino. And here is where the quiet cousin stops being quiet. Southern California in the early 1880s was in the middle of a religious revival. A preacher had brought the holiness movement out from Texas around 1880. It organized itself as the Southern California and Arizona Holiness Association, and its local groups were called holiness bands. And its own official history records that the first holiness meeting in that part of the state was held at San Bernardino, and that a band was organized there. Alice moved to San Bernardino in 1884. She joined in 1886. And she did not stay in the pews. She was ordained. She served as a pastor. Her gravestone and her memorial record call her Reverend, and state that she was ordained in the Holiness Church of California sometime before 1917. She edited the church's newspaper until ill health forced her to resign, and the year she resigned was 1917. There is one more claim attached to her, and I'm going to handle it carefully, because I think you deserve to know how strong a thing is before you repeat it. The research site that has done the most work on this family says that she was the first woman to hold office on the Board of Elders. I could not corroborate that anywhere. It appears in one place and nowhere else. And when I went to the denomination's own history, written in 1912, the officers it lists are a president, a secretary, a corresponding secretary, a treasurer, and trustees. The word elder doesn't appear in the part I could read, so I'm not going to tell you she was the first woman on the Board of Elders. What I will tell you is the part that is solidly on the record and is remarkable enough without it. A girl born in Wisconsin in 1862, who appears in a children's book for one line about making pictures in the snow, was an ordained minister and a pastor in California. She edited a denominational newspaper for years in a church that was itself led by a woman. Because that's the other thing. The denomination Alice Ingalls Whiting joined was, in its own account, a body over which a woman eventually assumed chief leadership, Josephine Washburn, who also wrote its history. So when I say a woman preaching in 1890s California, I don't want you to picture a lone eccentric. I want you to picture a small church where that was possible, at a moment when almost nowhere else in American Protestantism it was. Her life went on the way lives do. 5 children. Alpha in 1883, J. Riley in 1887, Roy in 1889, who grew up to be a minister as well, Frederick in 91, Vina in 99. J. Riley Whiting died in 1905. He was 18, The year is all anybody has written down. No date, no cause. There were years in Owensboro, Kentucky, about a year and a half, where Arthur farmed. There was a stretch living near Alice's brother down in Louisiana. In 1923, they came back to California and settled in Los Angeles. And through all of it, Alice and her sister Ella kept their mother. Peter Riley Ingalls died at Milaca, Minnesota, in March of 1900. And after that, Eliza Ann Quiner Ingalls went to California, and she alternated between her two daughters' houses for the rest of her life. She died on the 6th of June 1931 at Eagle Rock in Los Angeles County. She was 89 years old. She had outlived her sister Caroline by 7 years. She lies at San Jacinto Valley Cemetery, in the same ground as Ella. There is no headstone for her. The photograph on her memorial is a picture of the plot, and the note under it says it is right across from the office. Alice Josephine Ingalls Whiting died on the 30th of January, 1934, at Eagle Rock, in the same place her mother had died. She was 71. She is buried at Bellevue Memorial Park in Ontario, California, and her husband Arthur joined her there 15 years later. 2 years before she died, Little House in the Big Woods came out, with her in it, aged about 8, suggesting a game in the snow. I could find no obituary for her either, not in the San Bernardino paper, not in the Ontario paper. There is a denominational paper that she used to edit that would almost certainly have run one, and nobody has gone and looked. So put the two cousins next to each other. Lena, who said she'd never marry, married at 21 and had 8 children and buried 2 of them, and whose father shot a man and went to Waupun for 8 years, and none of that is in the book. Alice got one line about snow angels. She spent 30 years in a pulpit and at an editor's desk, and none of that is in the book either. Same family, same decade, same author. And what kind of church was it? Because otherwise ordained minister is just a phrase. The holiness movement came into Southern California around 1880, brought out from Texas by a preacher named Hardin Wallace. At a camp meeting in 1883, it adopted rules. The rules are worth hearing, because they tell you the temperature of the thing. Members were not to wear or sell gold as an ornament. No tobacco, no secret societies. That is a serious, plain, slightly austere kind of religion, and it was very small. By 1888, there were 12 congregations in the whole of Southern California and Arizona, and none of them was in Los Angeles. And its own official history, published in 1912, records that a woman eventually assumed chief leadership of it. Josephine Washburn. She wrote the history herself. So the body Alice Ingalls joined in 1886 was a church of a few hundred people that would, within her lifetime, be led by a woman. That matters for how you picture her. She was not a lone woman shouting at a hostile denomination. She was inside a small movement where a woman with a call could be ordained, given a pulpit, and handed the newspaper. And she kept that newspaper until 1917, when her health went. She was 55. She lived another 17 years after that, in Los Angeles, and I have no idea what she did with them, and neither does anybody else. Alice had 5 brothers and sisters, and their lives will give you the shape of that household. Ella Estella, born January 1865 in Pepin County. Peter Franklin in 66. Lansford Newcomb in 1870. Edith Florence in 72. And a last one, Edmund Llewellyn, in 1880, born after they had moved into Minnesota. They went from Jefferson County to Pepin, from Pepin to Pierce, and about 1874 across to Zumbro Falls in Wabasha County, Minnesota. And in 1888, after flood damage, they moved again, up to Milaca in Mille Lacs County. Flood damage. That's the whole reason, in 2 words, that a family with 6 children packed and went 100 miles north when the eldest was 26. Ella married Lee Whiting in 1883 and had 4 sons, Earl, Floyd, Harry, and Clarence. She lived until March of 1945 and died at Winchester in Riverside County, California, and she's buried at the San Jacinto Valley Cemetery. And that is the cemetery where their mother lies too, in the unmarked plot across from the office. I said the denomination Alice joined was small. Let me give you its whole life, because it is about the length of hers. It began around 1880 as a revival movement. By 1883, it had rules, and the rules tell you what kind of people these were. Members were forbidden to wear or sell gold as an ornament, no tobacco, no secret societies. By 1888, there were 12 congregations in the whole of Southern California, and not one of them was in Los Angeles. It ran a Bible school out at El Monte. It sent missionaries to Peru and to Palestine, which for a church of 12 congregations is either magnificent or slightly mad, and possibly both. And in 1946, 12 years after Alice Ingalls Whiting died, the whole body was received into a larger church and stopped existing under its own name. So the church she gave 30 years to lasted 66 years, start to finish. Its records survive in an archive in Indiana. There are yearbooks from 1917, 1918, 1920, and 1927 that list pastoral appointments and church business and directory information, and they have been digitized. Which means that somewhere in a filing system in Indiana, there is almost certainly a page with her name on it, listing what she was appointed to and what she edited, and it would take one afternoon to find. Nobody has been. The last woman tonight is the one you know best, and you have never once been told her name. Farmer Boy came out in 1933. It is the second Little House book, and it is the odd one, because Laura isn't in it. It's Almanzo's childhood, on his father's farm at Burke, in the far north of New York State, in the 1860s. And what people remember about Farmer Boy, above everything else, is the food. The pantry, the butter, the donuts frying, the weaving, a pumpkin pie the size of a wagon wheel, and a 9-year-old boy who is allowed to eat until he cannot move. Generations of American children have read that book hungry in the 1930s and the 1940s, and it has done something to them that the other 7 books don't do. It is the only one where the house is full. The woman running that house has a name in the book. She is called Mother. Her name was Angeline Albina Day. She was born on the 6th of March 1821 at Chateauguay, New York, which is right up on the Canadian line, and she was the daughter of Justin Day and Daydamia Bateman Day. She married James Mason Wilder on the 6th of August 1843, and then she had 6 children across 25 years, which is a sentence you should stop and feel the length of. Laura Ann in 1844, Royal in 47, Eliza Jane in 1850, Alice in 53, Almanzo in 1857, and then a gap of 12 years, and Pearlie in 1869, when she was 48. The eldest and the youngest of her children were 25 years apart. When Pearlie was born, Laura Ann was already married. Angeline Day Wilder was a mother continuously, of children in the house, from 23 years old until she was into her 60s. That is the woman in the kitchen. Now, Farmer Boy is a book about a farm that works, and I want to be precise about that, because the reason it feels so different from every other Little House book is not tone, it's solvency. The Wilders of Burke were not the Ingallses of anywhere. They owned their land. They had a barn full of stock. They had a full cellar in February. When Almanzo's father wants to make a point about money in that book, he can afford to make it. And in 1875, they sold that farm. 88 acres, $5,000. Put that beside the numbers we've been handling all night. Lansford Ingalls bought 80 acres for $300 in 1853 and lost them to a sheriff. Charlotte Quiner bought 40 acres for $50 as a widow. The Wilders sold 88 acres for $5,000. They were not in the same economy as the rest of this family. They were the ones the rest of this family married into. They went to Spring Valley in Fillmore County, Minnesota, where they had already bought land, and where they bought Angeline's brother George Day's own ground for $500 after he died, and where they held 90 acres and more. And they were substantial there too. The Methodist Episcopal Church at Spring Valley was building, and when the subscriptions were taken up in 1876, James Wilder pledged $50, which the local record notes as one of the largest amounts given. So picture her at 55. New state, new house, money in it, a husband on the church subscription list, 6 children grown or nearly. Now watch what the next 30 years do to her. In 1885, her son Almanzo, 28 years old, married an 18-year-old schoolteacher in De Smet, Dakota Territory. And I don't need to tell you what happened to those two, because this channel has spent a year on it. The hail, the diphtheria, the debts, the son who lived 27 days, the house that burned in August of 1889. What I do want to tell you is where they went afterwards. In the spring of 1890, Almanzo and Laura Ingalls Wilder came to Spring Valley, Minnesota, and moved in with his parents. They stayed about 18 months. So the woman in the farmer boy kitchen, at 69, took in her disabled son and his young wife and their 3-year-old daughter, in the worst year those two ever had, and kept them until they could go on. That 3-year-old was Rose. Rose Wilder Lane spent a year and a half of her early childhood in her grandmother Angeline's house. And in all the millions of words that woman later wrote about her own life, and there were millions, I have never seen her describe it. In 1892, Angeline's daughter Alice died. She was 38. Her daughter Eliza Jane was the schoolteacher, the one Laura disliked so much as a girl that she put her in a book about it 40 years later. In 1893, Eliza Jane married a man named Thomas Thayer and went south to Crowley, Louisiana, into the rice country. And in the middle 1890s, in their 70s, James and Angeline Wilder followed their children south to Louisiana. Which brings us to 1899. I'm going to give you this in order, because the order is the whole thing. Around January of 1899, her infant granddaughter Susan died. She was a few months old. In February of 1899, at Mermentau, Louisiana, her husband died. James Mason Wilder. They had been married 55 years. Within about 8 days of James, her son-in-law Thomas Thayer died, Eliza Jane's husband, which means that in the space of a fortnight, Angeline Wilder was widowed and her daughter was widowed. And on the 16th of April 1899, at Crowley, her eldest daughter died, Laura Ann Wilder Howard, 54 years old, the first child she ever had, born in the New York farmhouse in 1844, a grandchild in January, a husband in February, a son-in-law in February, her eldest daughter in April, 4 in 4 months, and she had already buried Alice 7 years before. She was 78 years old. She lived another 6 years. And here is the part that I did not expect and that stopped me when I found it. Those 6 years, she was in Crowley, Louisiana, and in 1903, a 16-year-old girl arrived in Crowley from Missouri to live with her aunt Eliza Jane and finish high school. That was Rose. So the granddaughter who had lived in her house at 3 was in the same small Louisiana town in her last years. Rose graduated from Crowley High School in 1904, first in a class of 7, and recited a poem in Latin at the ceremony. Her grandmother was 83 years old and living in that town. Whether she was in the room, nobody has written down. Angeline Albina Day Wilder died on the 29th of December, 1905. She was 84. She is buried in South Crowley Cemetery in Acadia Parish, Louisiana, which is roughly 1,500 miles from the farmhouse at Burke, New York, where the pantry was, and where the donuts were, and where the woman that American children call Mother has been standing, in print, since 1933. So what do we know about her, as against her kitchen? Almost nothing, and it is the same nothing we have hit 4 times tonight. We have censuses, we have the deed for the 1875 sale, we have Fillmore County land records, we have the Spring Valley Methodist Episcopal Church Register, which records the family's baptisms and marriages, and a subscription list with her husband's $50 on it. We have a Find a Grave memorial. We have a book her son's wife wrote about her house 40 years after she died. We do not have a letter. We do not have a diary. We do not have a single recorded sentence in her own voice. There is one thing, though. and it's a strange one. Farmer Boy exists in manuscript as well as in print, and the manuscript pages contain material that was cut. Among the cut material is the family's decision to leave New York and go west, which means that Laura wrote it and then it came out. The book ends with Almanzo, 9 years old, being told he can have his own colt and staying on the farm. The real story is that the farm was sold and they all went to Minnesota, and then most of them went to Louisiana. And the woman who ran that kitchen died in a rice town in Acadia Parish, having outlived 2 daughters, a husband, a son-in-law and a grandchild. Laura had that. She wrote some of it down, and then she took it out and gave the children the pantry instead. I want to stay in that kitchen a minute, because I think the reason Farmer Boy works on people is worth naming out loud. Every other Little House book is about not having enough. Not enough wheat, not enough coal, not enough kerosene, not enough distance between you and the weather. The pleasure in those books is the pleasure of getting through. Farmer Boy is about having enough. It is the only one. There is a scene where Almanzo comes in from the cold and the table has been laid. The book simply lists what is on it, and the list goes on and on. That is the entire dramatic content of the passage. Pies, preserves, cheese, butter by the pound, donuts, milk. There's a moment where the boy is given a whole quarter of a pie and nobody stops him. And there is the pantry itself, shelf after shelf, and the description of the weaving and the churning and the candle making and the pork barrels, and it reads like an inventory because it is an inventory. It reads like an inventory because it is one. A 9-year-old's memory of a house where the work was done and could be counted. Somebody had to do all of it. The butter in that book is butter she made. The candles are candles she dipped. The weaving is her loom. The pantry that has fed the imagination of about 4 generations of American children was a pantry that one woman filled every year for 30 years, while having 6 children over 25 of them. And the book calls her mother twice a page and never once tells you her name or where she was born or that she came from Chateauguay up on the Canadian border or what happened to her afterwards. I don't think that's a slight. In a children's book about a boy, the mother is mother, and that's how it works. But it does mean that the single most beloved domestic interior in American children's literature is anonymous, and the woman who built it died in Louisiana in 1905, and nobody has written a paragraph about her since. Now, Spring Valley. Those 18 months are the one moment when almost everybody in tonight's episode is in the same building. The spring of 1890. Almanzo Wilder is 33 years old. He has had diphtheria 2 years earlier, and something has happened to the nerves in his legs, and it has not gone away. He walks with a cane. He cannot follow a plough for a day, and he never will again. His wife is 23. In the previous 18 months she has lost a wheat crop to hot winds, buried a son who lived 27 days, and watched her house burn down in August. They have a 3-year-old daughter, and effectively nothing else. And they go to his mother. James and Angeline Wilder had the farm at Spring Valley, Fillmore County, Minnesota, the one they had moved to in 1875 when they sold Burke, 90 acres and more, a church subscription with $50 of their money on it. Angeline was 69. They stayed from the spring of 1890 until October of 1891, 18 months. Laura helped her mother-in-law with the housework, which is a sentence that appears in the record and does about 1/10 of the work it should. Think about what that house contained. A woman of 69, her disabled son, her daughter-in-law who was 23 and had buried a baby that summer and was not going to talk about it for 50 years, and a small girl. The small girl was Rose Wilder Lane, who would grow up to type every one of her mother's manuscripts. And Farmer Boy, the book about Angeline's kitchen at Burke, was written 43 years later by the daughter-in-law who spent 18 months in Angeline's kitchen at Spring Valley in the worst year of her life. I cannot prove that the second kitchen is in the first one. Nobody can. Laura never said so, but she wrote one book in that whole series about a house where there was enough of everything, and it is the house of the woman who took her in. And what was Angeline's actual working year in that famous house? Farmer Boy will tell you, if you read it as a document instead of as a meal. There is the weaving, which means carding and spinning before there is any weaving to do. There is the butter, made twice a week in quantity, packed and sold. There is candle dipping. There is the pork, killed and salted and put down in barrels. There is the drying and the preserving, which is a summer-long second occupation. There is the baking, which in a house that size is measured in barrels of flour a year, not loaves. And there is the great annual event of the book, which is not a harvest or a fair, but the making of the year's supply of food, over weeks, by a woman and her daughters, Laura Ann, Eliza Jane, Alice, 3 daughters, working alongside her in the years the book covers. 2 of those 3 daughters were dead before their mother was, Alice at 38 in 1892, Laura Ann at 54 in April of 1899. The girls in that kitchen, she outlived 2 of them, and the third, Eliza Jane, was widowed in the same fortnight her mother was, and it was Eliza Jane's house in Crowley that the family gathered into afterwards, and Eliza Jane who took in Rose in 1903. The Wilder women held that family together in Louisiana for a decade. In a rice town none of them had been born within 1,000 miles of, and the only reason any of us have heard of a word of it is a book about how much there was to eat in New York in 1866. And I should say plainly that these 5 are not the whole of it. They are the 5 with enough surviving record to carry a story. There are others in those books who get a name and a moment and nothing else, and for most of them the paper trail runs out inside a paragraph. Grandma Ingalls had daughters, Polly and Lydia and Docia and Ruby, who died at 26. Docia alone had 7 more daughters after Lena, and for 4 of them all that survives is a year of birth. Alice had a sister, Ella, who married the brother of Alice's husband, raised 4 sons, kept their mother in her house in rotation, and died in California in 1945. There is no chapter about her either, in any book or anywhere else. Lotty had 5 brothers and sisters and 6 children, and I could not find a photograph of any of them. Angeline had a daughter called Laura Ann, who was cut out of Farmer Boy entirely. There were 6 Wilder children, and the book shows 3. And the wives. Every one of those Ingalls brothers married somebody, and for 2 of them, Lansford James's 2 wives, I could not establish a single name. 2 marriages, documented by Dayton County in 1866 and 1900, and the women in them are not recorded anywhere I could reach. That is not a gap in the research. That is what the 19th century did with the names of farm wives in Wisconsin. I mention it because I don't want tonight to feel like 5 recovered women and a job finished. It isn't. It's 5 women who happened to leave enough behind to be followed, out of a much larger number who didn't. So let's put the 5 of them together, because they were not chosen at random, they chose themselves, in the sense that they are what is left when you go through the books looking for women who get one scene and no second one. Laura Louise Colby Ingalls, born 1810. Charlotte Elizabeth Holbrook Moore, born 1854. Lena Evelyn Waldvogel, born 1866. Alice Josephine Ingalls, born 1862. Angeline Albina Day Wilder, born 1821. 133 years between the first birth and the last death. Wisconsin, New York, Minnesota, Dakota Territory, Nebraska, Illinois, California, Louisiana. What do they actually have in common? 4 things, and all 5 of them share every one. The first is land. Every one of these women's lives is organized around a piece of ground that was bought, or lost, or sold, or filed on. 80 acres on the Oconomowoc River, gone to a sheriff in January of 1861. 40 acres bought by a widow in her own name for $50 in 1848. A homestead on Devil's Lake taken up at 72. Railroad contracts across 5 states out of a wagon. 88 acres in New York sold for $5,000. None of those transactions is in a woman's name except one, and that one is only in a woman's name because her husband drowned. That is not a coincidence, and it isn't a moral. It's the property law of the 19th century, working exactly as designed. A married woman in most of the United States before the 1860s could not hold real property apart from her husband. Her legal personality was inside his, which means that when you read a deed from that century, you are reading a document that has been constructed to leave the woman out. So when we say, there's nothing of Laura Louise Colby Ingalls in the record, part of what we are describing is not an accident of preservation, it's a rule. The second thing is that they moved. And did any of them choose it? Grandma Ingalls packed a household at least 8 times between Quebec and Burnett County. Angeline Day Wilder went from the Canadian border of New York to Minnesota at 54 and to Louisiana in her 70s. Dochia raised 9 children out of a wagon. Alice went Wisconsin, Minnesota, Dakota, California, Kentucky, Louisiana, California again. In the books, moving is Pa's restlessness, and it is written as a kind of weather that happens to a family. In the record, moving is what a woman does after somebody else has made a decision. Every one of those migrations has a man's signature on the paperwork and a woman's hands on the crockery. The third thing is that they buried children. Grandma Ingalls buried an infant in 1835 who is recorded as 2 words. Charlotte Quiner buried a daughter at 4. Lotty Moore buried 4 of her 6. Lena Heikes buried a 5-year-old and a 27-year-old. Angeline Wilder buried Alice at 38, and Laura Ann at 54, and a grandchild in infancy. That's 5 women and, at a conservative count, 11 graves. And the fourth thing is the one that made me want to do this episode at all. Not one of them left a word. No diary, no letter, no signature, not one recorded sentence in the first person by any of the 5. Everything I have told you tonight came out of somebody else's paper, land deeds. Homestead affidavits, a prison sentence in a county newspaper, census schedules, church subscription lists, cemetery records, a daughter-in-law's letter about hops, a sister's letter about a baby, a granddaughter's novel. 5 women, 133 years between the first birth and the last death, and the closest we get to any of their voices is Eliza Ann Quiner writing about her baby. She is the prettiest little girl you ever saw. And then breaking off, because the baby wanted holding. That baby was Alice, who grew up to be a minister, and who also left nothing. Now the question that has been sitting under this whole episode, why aren't they in the books? And I want to answer it properly, because the lazy answer is that Laura Ingalls Wilder was writing for children, and children don't want to hear about sheriff's auctions and prison sentences and a woman burying 4 of her 6. That's true as far as it goes. It just isn't the whole of it, and we can do better, because the principle these books were built on was written down. In January of 1938, Rose Wilder Lane wrote her mother a letter about how the 2 of them worked. They were in the middle of By the Shores of Silver Lake, which is the book Lena is in, and Rose put it like this: "You must take into account the actual distinction between truth and fact. It is beyond all human power to tell all the facts. Your whole life spent at nothing else would not tell all the facts of one morning in your life, just an ordinary morning when you get up, dress, get breakfast and wash the dishes. Facts are infinite in number. The truth is a meaning underlying them. You tell the truth by selecting the facts which illustrate it." That is the operating instruction for 8 books, in 5 sentences. You tell the truth by selecting the facts which illustrate it. And once you have that in your hand, everything we've looked at tonight stops being an omission and starts being a choice. Uncle George blowing the bugle illustrates something. Uncle George not having been a drummer boy does not. Aunt Lotty refusing to say whose hair is prettier illustrates something, and it illustrates it beautifully, and it is arguably the single most decent moment in the whole first book. Aunt Lotty burying 4 children and dying at her daughter's house in Waukegan illustrates nothing that belongs in a chapter about 2 little girls being vain. Lena driving the ponies too fast and saying she'll marry a railroader and keep moving west illustrates freedom, Lena's father firing a shotgun into a man's face at 10 paces on a Saturday night does not illustrate freedom. It illustrates something else entirely, and Laura knew exactly what it illustrated, because in 1937 she wrote it down in a letter and used the word skeleton. And there's the line, isn't there? Selection isn't lying, but selection is a decision made by somebody for a reason, and the reason is almost never neutral. The choices these books make are consistently in one direction. They keep the women who are useful to a scene and drop the women who would need a chapter. They keep the moment and drop the 60 years, and the effect compounds. Over 8 books, 90 years, and tens of millions of copies, an entire category of person has been left standing at the edge of the most read family story in America. In a pink dress, holding a doll, blowing on a stick of candy, with nothing behind them. I don't think Laura Ingalls Wilder owed them a chapter. She was writing about her own childhood, and a childhood is a narrow window on purpose. But I do think somebody owed them a look, and it has been 94 years since Little House in the Big Woods came out. As far as I can establish, this is the first time anyone has gone and got all 5 of them and put them in a row. Is any of this still findable? That's the practical thing I want to leave you with, and then we'll set it down. Almost everything I have told you tonight came from documents that a person could go and look at. Deeds in Jefferson County, a homestead final proof in Pierce County, 2 issues of the Pierce County Herald from May and June of 1868, a church subscription list in Fillmore County, Minnesota, cemetery records in 5 states. And there are 4 specific things that would fill in most of what's still blank, and none of them requires a scholar. Somebody could read the 26 letters at the Wisconsin Historical Society, 91 pages of them, and find out whether Lotty is mentioned in any of them. Somebody could pull the Jefferson County paper for the 3rd week of February 1939 and see whether her obituary says she was in a famous book. Somebody could open the Walpun prison register and find out what August Waldvogel was actually convicted of and when he came out. And somebody could write to an archive in Indiana and ask for the 1917 yearbook of the Holiness Church of California. One afternoon would tell you exactly what Alice Ingalls Whiting was appointed to, what she edited, and whether there was a board of elders at all. 4 afternoons. That's the entire remaining gap. I find that more moving than I expected to, and I'll tell you why. It isn't that these women were lost. Losing implies distance. They are 8 feet away, in boxes, in county courthouses in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and a filing system in Indiana, indexed, catalogued, and in some cases already scanned. Nobody has just wanted to know. 5 graves then, and we're done. Orange Cemetery, Webster, Wisconsin, where Laura Louise Colby Ingalls has lain since October of 1883, with her husband beside her, who filed on new land at 83 and lasted 56 days. Evergreen Cemetery, Fort Atkinson, Section 19, Lot 2, where they brought Lottie Moore back across the state line to lie in the county where her mother bought 40 acres for $50. Graceland Park, Sioux City, Iowa, where Lena is, about 130 miles from the railroad camp, having not kept moving west. Bellevue Memorial Park, Ontario, California, where Alice is, with Arthur beside her, 15 years later. And South Crowley Cemetery, Acadia Parish, Louisiana, where Angeline Day Wilder was put down in the last days of 1905, 1,500 miles from the Pantry. 2 of them lie in the same state, about 270 miles apart. After that, the gaps run to 1,000 miles and more. The books have them all in one place, for one afternoon each, in the snow and on the road, and at the dance and in the kitchen, and then the page turns. They went a long way after that. Sleep well. You can put the rest of it down now. Good night.